Hi, everybody. This is a review recording for the final exam. It's got, I think, around 70 questions. And again, it's just three, effectively four, because we do male and female phys. But effectively, this is what it's about. So we start with digestive, a fair amount of urinary, I would dare say. And then, I would say urinary is the predominant theme. Well, as I go through this, you'll be able to discern. Okay, everybody knows about lactose intolerance. What is lactose intolerance come from? An enzyme called lactase not being present. The question is, where is that enzyme? You need to find out where it's located, and that'll give you the answer to one of the questions. There's a lot of most of the absorption goes on in the small intestine, but there's a certain in the large intestine, even though it's mostly water and some electrolytes, there are certain vitamins that we talked about in lecture. Which ones were those that are either formed and or absorbed in that particular area? So I think you need to be familiar with that. And then certainly, and this is one of those, you've seen them before, pairing questions. So it basically has to do with digestive system enzymes being matched with what they do. So we know amylase is starch and lipase and protease and nucleases and all those types of things. Which one of there's going to be basically you have to know a little what I call factoids about them, either where they're produced or do they digest proteins or where we find them, you know, that type of stuff, what location, something along those lines, some typical fact. And so, I mean, so any of the ones, whether it's maltase or lactase, whether it's pepsin, whether it's trypsin, whether it's chymotrypsin, whether it's amylase, any of those aces, know a fair amount about them. So be pick the one that's incorrectly matched. You've seen those questions 1,000 times. All kinds of stuff. I just mentioned one of the answers. So remember, the small bowel is so important. Nearly everything goes on there. The vast majority of the chemical digestion, the vast majority of the absorption that's there. What pH? The distinction between the stomach and the small bowel, the pH aspects of things. What materials go in that area to facilitate either chemical digestion or absorption? All those are important that are there. We looked at some of the structural issues or the structural modifications, better word, that play a role, the plica circularis, the villi, the microvilli, all about those. So know something, what do the villi contain? Where are the microvilli found? Why does that make it a brush border? What does that really signify? Um, what actually is the lacteal? Is it lymphatic? Is it a blood vessel? Is it a combination, etc., etc.? So I think all of those are part of the thing, and basically, how do things get there? Okay, we have what's that? I talked about it endlessly. Let me, if I say, know the role about the common bile duct and where it comes from. It comes from basically the bile duct from the liver and the pancreatic duct from the pancreas, and effectively what those two bring and the secretions they make and where they enter, what structure, all of that is important. Okay? Know the role of the appendix. That's also important. Something to remember. All of those interesting, there's a few anatomical landmarks. I don't think they're not on here. What happens again in the large intestine? I just described it. And again, what's meant by the term zymogen? Zyme, we know what zyme is and what ogen is. And so put those two together and think of what it does in order to, let's say, make that, make the ogen, as it were, disappear. And what happens after that? So all of these are features. Remember what actually comes in by way of that famous brushboard. It has to be particles that can pass through. And the way that they pass through, as we already know, is in very, very small amounts. Very, very, very tiny molecular would be a better way to describe it. Small size, not amount. And so it's amino acids, it's monosaccharides, it's nucleotide, the basics of nucleotide. Whether they may even, I'm not sure whether they lop off the phosphate, but they might, and and they may very well even lop off something on top of that. And again, all of those are important. What happens? The difference we have to break down triglycerides basically into glycerols and fatty acids and work from there. So all of that, understand that part of it. It's all about understanding how that works. And I commented on this pretty easily, or not easily, pretty thoroughly in the context of lecture. And then we get on, that was the first 10 or 11 questions. We get on to the kidney. What's the functional unit of the kidney? You should all know what it is. There's ones in the cortex, there's ones close to the medulla. Okay, that the uniqueness of the blood supply, I went into it in anatomy. I reviewed it here because it plays such an important role in the physiology. Why we have, what happens at that particular unique feature that's there. What does the Bowman capsule actually do as fluid leaves, as the filtrate leaves the glomerulus? What actually happens to it? Where does it go from there? And then what processes go on? So know what occurs basically at each glomerulus. Know what happens, what the roles of the Bowman's capsule, know what the roles are in the proximal and distal convoluted tubules, the short nephron loops, the long nephron loops, peritubular capillaries, vasorecta, all the way into the collecting ducts. We spent a fair amount of time by that. So understand all those things. I tried to make the points of emphasis in the lecture recordings. Know about that juxtaglomerular apparatus. We have salt sensors in the macula densa. We have pressure sensors in the juxtaglomerular cells, and understand what major pathway is triggered by the release of involving those juxtaglomerular cells. And if I can't spell it out to you any more than that. So keep looking at all of those, where they're located. They function on anatomically, so know where the juxtaglomerular cells are, know where the macula densa is, and the roles that they play. We went into the whole idea, the distinction of what filtrate is, the massive amount of filtrate that's produced, and then how much of it is reabsorbed. There were charts that were available to you. We talked about how much of that is reabsorbed comparatively and what that means to us with regard to how much urine we typically produce throughout the day. And so what's the important part about this? Okay. Remember the idea that we're dealing initially with filtration is based on pressure more than anything else, and what the role of angiotensin is. And when we talk about angiotensin, I mean, understand, I didn't specify it. When we do come to the exam, we're talking about the activated form of angiotensin, angiotensin 2, and what it does. But it's fairly straightforward because angiotensin 1 does kind of the same thing. But angiotensin 2 was a little more specific about it. But I won't distinguish between that on the exam. I'll just call it angiotensin. Look at the nervous system, what controls kidney and what controls blood flow to it. What does aldosterone do? The whole idea of what happens with that very complex process, that involves with the countercurrent multiplier and the countercurrent exchanger. What is the end product of all of that? It's such a significant feature that you have to be familiar with it. And so just to continue on with those types of things. And so when we look at these, what is involved? Okay. When we're in the proximal and distal convoluted tubules, that's where, when they're active, they're doing active transport. Basically active transport and secondary active transport. That's where the energy is conserved by the system that exists to make the filtrate. If you recall exactly what all of that is, the role of antidiuretic hormone, certainly the specifics about aldosterone, the four mechanisms that are part of that renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism, exactly what products in the urine shouldn't be there, and what that means, what the concept of transport maximum is all part of the picture. Okay? And have an idea what really urine is made out of. And I think that's a fair part of it. Now, at this point, we've covered the better part of about 30 questions, and we'll move into the next part. And some of this we haven't reviewed yet, from a lecture perspective, that's this week, and it has a lot to do. Now we're dealing with reproductive structures. So there's a certain amount of anatomy to remember. In the male, I think the anatomy is a little more complicated. The role of the epididymis, the role of the prostate gland, the role of the seminal gland. I went over that this is Sunday, and I went over that Friday in lecture. So if weren't there, didn't get a chance to listen to it, go back and listen to Friday's lecture. Well, the whole idea, I mean, I think it's important to understand the role, because it was more anatomy, but the role of cryptorchism, okay, that undescended testicle is, okay, the relationship that have vis-a-vis testicular cancer. I think that's important. We actually talked about it. I had a question in lecture about it regarding the whole idea of the descent to the testicles, what role that plays in physiology, why is that advantageous? I commented on that blood testicular barrier, why that's significant, what problems would exist if that was somehow breached, okay, and effectively why that's a matter for concern. I went over the constituents, or the what's found in the ejaculant, and where are the big contributors. Is it seminal? Is it prostate? Is it the sperm itself, etc., etc.? That's important. We talked a little bit about the prostate. It pays to go over that material again. If you might recall, some of these questions are revisited from when we took the final in anatomy. Okay, all of those kinds of things that are important. So if you've got a moment, take a look at all those things and see what's important with regard to the prostate, how we're able to assess prostate problems. What's because you're talking about prostate and you're talking about breast problems when you get to the female. Again, the interplay between parasympathetic and sympathetic control vis-a-vis sexual function, both in the male and the female. One is involved in stimulation, or basically the aspect of, I'm trying to think is the right word to describe that. So when we're talking about the concept in the male, between arousal is the word I was groping for, probably the wrong term to use in the form of groping. Arousal, which system is involved in arousal and which system is involved in climax. And we're talking about the male and the female, whether it's erection and ejaculation, or whether it's arousal and orgasm. All of those things are obviously important. I mean, obviously we get to the distinction when we start talking about the physiology of it, that the male, in order for, when we talk about physiology, when we talk about, if we're talking about fertilization, ejaculation has to occur. In the female, climax does not have to occur for conception to take place. In the male, obviously, it would have to occur. Obviously, because there's different processes. Don't forget that arc we talked about, the GnRH stimulating the LH and FSH. What triggers the GnRH? Low amounts of either testosterone or estrogen or progesterone. The GnRH comes from the posterior pituitary. That's the release. The RH stands for releasing hormone. The name is gonadotropin release hormone. What does it do? It stimulates the ovaries and the testes. It stimulates the pituitary gland to release FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone, or eggs and sperm, luteinizing hormone, the various other hormones, estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone, of course. So all of those are significant to remember and understand. Sperm derive their energy source from one sugar. You should know what sugar that is. Okay, what does prostatic fluid do? What does seminal fluid do? What are they notable for? Okay, all of those kinds of things are significant. Okay, the role of nitric oxide vis-a-vis the erection, we talked about that on Friday in lecture. And obviously that leads to a question most likely about erectile dysfunction and why that's so effective. And then we haven't gotten into it, but we're going to look at some of the structure in the fallopian tubes, the modifications. We're talking about fimbriae. We're talking about cilia. We're talking about threads of mucus and eddies and currents. You might remember those from what we talked about anatomy. I realize it's effectively a full semester ago. Okay. the very famous test for evaluating the cervical lining, which we hear so much about, screening for cancerous changes, particularly when we're talking about HPV and those related cancer changes, some cervical cancer, and to some extent penile cancer, but we don't use that test. This is a test for the female. We're going to learn, and we'll go over again because it was part anatomy and part physiology, the role of the two strata in the uterus of the endometrium. We have the stratum basalis and the functionalis, know which one is there and which one is sloughed vis-a-vis menstruation, which arteries are involved in that, what happens to them, what triggers them to go into, and they're the spiral arteries, what triggers them to go into spasm, why the menstrual, effectively why that stratum is sloughed, what's really in menstrual fluid, is it only blood, is there more to it than that? Anatomically, we'll revisit the axillary tail of the breast itself, and because of the lymphatic structures, why we're so cognizant of what's going on in the axilla, okay, and having to do lymph node dissections vis-a-vis breast cancer. I think that's important. The nature of what the breast is anatomically, it's less glandular tissue and more fat. I think we covered that before. Where estrogen does most of its work, where progesterone does most of its work. What do high levels of estrogen and progesterone suppress? Okay. What occurs during menopause and what begins to change? Menopause is a life changer, as everybody knows, but it has other things because now the absence of the production of estrogen and, relatively speaking, very little estrogen and very little progesterone, how does that affect the female physiologically? What's good? Is there anything good about that? What changes, etc.? Because we hear all the things, and maybe you know about it from your moms and from older relatives, or if you're like me, we live with it for all the changes that happen with aging. But that one in particular, vis-a-vis menopausal, is important. Understand what the follicle is, what we call the mature follicle. What's the significance? Because anatomically, it has a distinctive structure, which tells you what its name is. It has to do with the fluid that's in it. Okay, and we have to know the cycles. We're going to go over at length, and it's going to be tomorrow. If you're listening to this, it means it's going to be on Monday the 28th. The distinction between the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle. I hope to get that done. If not tomorrow, maybe by Wednesday. Okay. In that cycle, we'll be able to look at what causes ovulation. Okay. We'll talk about, down the road, we'll talk about the usual locations for fertilization, the role of the corpus luteum. These are all parts of it. The distinction between the corpus luteum and the corpus albicans. And then there's a nice section that I do want to get to, and it'll probably be mostly on Wednesday, sexually transmitted diseases. And I think we have to talk about that. Which ones are common, which ones are not. And if you did not know, the most common bacterial disease now that's sexually transmitted, it used to be gonorrhea and syphilis. Now it's chlamydia, because it's different. We have to know the way. Herpes and HPV, which are, believe me, are more commonly transmitted, as is Trichomonas vaginalis, are not bacteria. Two are viruses, and one is a protozoan. All right. What hormones are most active in the different phases? Again, we talked about testosterone production when it peaked in males and how long it lasts. The incidence of breast cancer is going to be important. Okay. The significance of the anatomical distinction of the discontinuity between the ovary and the fallopian tubes, that comes into play. Okay. Bits about what occurs during ovulation. And I think that's the vast majority of this. Okay. And again, you're going to see there's two phases when we talk about the ovarian cycle. One is relatively constant. One has a day or two variability. We'll review that once more. And if we did not, we will review that. And I think that's everything for now. All right. Thanks very much. It's just very roundabout. You've been down a block before. You don't need a lot of background for this. There's plenty of time to study it. We've covered everything. So good luck. And thank you.